When we hear the word infertility, we often picture, a couple that's never been able to conceive.
Right.
But these medical excerpts you send over, they paint a much broader picture, don't they?
They do, yeah. Infertility, it's not always about that first experience trying to get pregnant. The definition's more nuanced than that.
Okay.
We hear about primary infertility, sure, but this source, it talks about something called secondary subfertility, and suddenly it feels like we're having a different conversation.
So it's not as clear-cut as just have you ever conceived or not. There are other paths to get to this challenge of infertility.
Yeah, exactly. Secondary subfertility, it means there's been a successful pregnancy in the past, but then there are struggles conceiving again. And medically speaking, it doesn't actually change the definition of infertility, typically. That's still not conceiving after a year of unprotected sex.
Flesh.
But emotionally, that's a whole other story.
Oh, I bet. To go through parenthood once and then to hit these roadblocks trying again, it makes you think about the emotional side of this, even before you factor in any of the science.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've hit on such a crucial point. The source we're looking at, it goes deep into the biological mechanisms, all the ins and outs of infertility, but that emotional weight, it's a constant. It's there in every single test, every treatment decision.
And speaking of the science, before it even gets into risk factors or anything like that, the source breaks down what it calls the 4 key requirements for conception.
Mm-hmm.
And reading through them, wow, you really get a sense of just how complex, how intricate this whole process is.
It really is like this perfectly choreographed dance,
Right.
You need the woman to have a healthy egg, the man needs viable sperm, and those two have to meet up at just the right time and just the right place, which is the fallopian tubes, of course.
It's amazing to think it ever works when you put it that way.
Right. And then if that egg is fertilized, it still has to travel and implant successfully in the uterus. It's incredible how often this all goes off without a hitch.
Right. And I guess with so many different factors at play, it's not surprising that the source, it lists a pretty overwhelming range of risk factors for infertility, both for men and for women.
Yeah.
I have to say, just skimming through that list, it really opened my eyes to just how many things can potentially impact a couple's ability to conceive.
It's a lot to process, that's for sure. To make it a little easier to digest, it helps to think about them in categories. Like one of the first things that jumped out at me was the role of lifestyle choices and how those can impact fertility for both men and women.
So let's talk about those lifestyle factors. Are we talking about, major life overhauls here? What kind of things are we talking about?
It's not always drastic changes, no. I mean, some of the usual suspects are definitely there. If you smoke, if you drink alcohol regularly, if you're significantly over or underweight, those are all things that can mess with your hormone balance. And obviously that impacts sperm production and egg production.
So it's not even necessarily about specific conditions, just generally being healthy, maintaining a healthy lifestyle that's important for both partners.
Exactly, yeah. And it really drives home that this is a shared journey for couples.
Right.
It's easy to think, oh, one glass of wine here or there won't hurt. But I was reading in the source, there was a study showing that even moderate alcohol consumption, it can lower sperm count by as much as 20%.
Wow. 20%. That's significant. Okay. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. But then there are also factors that are gender specific. Right.
Absolutely. And for women, one of the things the source really highlights is the impact of infections. And not just while you're actively trying to conceive, but even the long-term effects of past infections.
So I'm guessing this is where things like pelvic inflammatory disease, PID, would come into play. Because I know that untreated STIs can increase the risk of that, right?
Exactly. So PID, it can cause scarring in the fallopian tubes. And remember we were talking about how delicate that whole system is? The egg and the sperm need to meet in the fallopian tubes.
Right.
And scar tissue from those infections, it can completely block the tubes, or it can create roadblocks that make it hard for the egg to travel.
So even if the egg's released, even if it's fertilized, if it can't get to the uterus to implant because of the scarring, that's it. It's game over.
Exactly. And the source also specifically mentions ectopic pregnancies and tubal ligation, kind of along these same lines.
Right.
Ectopic pregnancies, that's where the fertilized egg implants outside of the uterus. Obviously, that's incredibly dangerous, and it can also lead to scarring. And then tubal ligation, that's the procedure where the fallopian tubes are intentionally blocked as a form of sterilization.
Right, right. So again, it all comes back to those fallopian tubes and how vulnerable they are to damage from these infections or from these procedures.
Yeah. And then you have conditions like endometriosis, which the source mentions can be a significant factor for a lot of women.
I've always been a little bit unclear about endometriosis. It seems to be fairly common, but maybe not well understood. Can you give us a quick breakdown of what that actually is?
Sure. Endometriosis, it affects something like 1 in 10 women, which is a lot. And essentially what happens is tissue similar to the lining of the uterus, it starts growing outside the uterus on the ovaries, the fallopian tubes, sometimes even elsewhere in the pelvis.
Okay, so what's the problem with that? If it's like the lining of the uterus, why is that an issue?
So even though it's in the wrong place, this tissue, it still reacts to your menstrual cycle. So every month you get inflammation, pain, sometimes bleeding, and you guessed it, scarring. And that scarring, just like we were talking about with PID, it can interfere with the egg's journey to the uterus, or it can even mess with implantation.
It's interesting. It's kind of frustrating how much of this seems to circle back to those fallopian tubes.
Yeah, they're really the central players in all of this.
Right. Now, switching gears a little bit to the man side of the equation, I was looking through the source, and I noticed some surprising risk factors for men, like undescended testicles, for example. I didn't realize that could have anything to do with infertility.
It makes sense when you think about it. The scrotum, where the testicles are, its job is to keep the sperm at just the right temperature. If one or both of the testicles haven't descended properly like they're supposed to during development, it can throw off the temperature, and that impacts both how much sperm is produced and the quality of the sperm.
So something that seems completely unrelated to reproduction can actually have these downstream impacts later on.
Yeah, exactly. Another one that surprised me was mumps. I mean, we think of that as a childhood illness, right?
Right. I can't even imagine getting mumps as an adult.
I know, right? So mumps on its own, it doesn't directly cause infertility, but if a male gets mumps after puberty, it can cause inflammation of the testicles, which is called orchitis. And what can inflammation lead to?
And scarring. Is that where this is going?
You got it. And when there's scarring there, it can block the flow of sperm.
Okay, so we've got lifestyle factors that can impact both partners. We've got the potential for scarring from infections or procedures that impacts women specifically. And then these kind of less obvious things like endometriosis, undescended testicles. But we can't really talk about risk factors for infertility without talking about age, can we?
We can. It's a sensitive subject, but it's definitely addressed in the source, and it is a factor for both men and women, though it's more pronounced in women.
And I mentioned there's a lot of pressure on women, especially, today's world, trying to balance career aspirations with starting a family.
Oh, absolutely. There's this disconnect sometimes between societal expectations and the biological realities of female fertility.
So, could break down the science for us a little bit. Why is age such a big factor for women in particular?
So, biologically speaking, women are born with all the eggs they're ever going to have. And as we age, both the number and the quality of those eggs, they naturally decline. And I mean, it's natural, but it does mean that the older a woman gets, the harder it can be to conceive and the higher the risks of complications during pregnancy.
It's not impossible, obviously, to have a healthy pregnancy at an older age.
No, not at all. And there are plenty of women who do. But statistically speaking, the chances do go down.
So while everyone's different, it's important to understand how that biological clock, so to speak, works. And just to be clear for our listener, while age is less of a factor for men, it is still a factor, right?
It is. Men produce sperm throughout their lives, it's true. But the amount of sperm and the quality of the sperm, that does tend to decline with age, although not usually as dramatically as what we see in women.
Okay. So we've got all these potential factors at play: lifestyle choices, past infections, these medical conditions we talked about, age. It seems like trying to pinpoint the exact cause of infertility for a couple must be like solving a mystery.
You're telling me. And that's exactly why that diagnostic process, which is what the source digs into next, is so important.
Yeah, it really does feel like you're putting together a puzzle, trying to figure out what's going on.
It is a puzzle, absolutely. And that's where the source goes next, all the tests and assessments that are used to diagnose infertility.
Right.
And it's pretty comprehensive. I mean, I can see how it would feel overwhelming to even navigate all of that.
Yeah. You're already dealing with the emotional stress of struggling to conceive, and then to go through all these tests, each one with its own procedures and the waiting and the uncertainty. It's a lot.
It is. It really highlights that this isn't just a physical journey. It's emotional, it's mental, it's all of those things.
So when a couple is going through this diagnostic process, what are some of the tests that they might expect to encounter?
Well, for men, a really common starting point is semen analysis.
Right. Yeah. And I have to admit, I was reading in the source about how men have to abstain from sexual activity for like 2 to 5 days before providing a sample. And it made me chuckle a little bit, like this whole process isn't unromantic enough already.
Right.
But seriously, why is that waiting period so important?
So it's all about getting an accurate measurement, basically.
Mm-hmm.
That 2 to 5 day window, it ensures that they're getting a good picture of the sperm count, the motility, that's how well the sperm are moving, and the morphology, which is the shape and structure of the sperm.
Right, because even a perfectly healthy sperm, if it's swimming in circles, it's not going to get very far.
Right, exactly, yeah.
So what about assessing female infertility? Some of the tests that are mentioned in the source, they sound, I don't know, kind of intimidating. Like there's one, it's called, are you ready for this? Hysterosalpingography. I can't even.
Mouthful.
It's a mouthful. I get lost just trying to say it.
Right.
What even is that?
So it sounds much scarier than it actually is, I promise. Let's break it down. So hystero, that refers to the uterus. Salpingo, that's the fallopian tubes. And kegography, it just means they're using imaging. So basically what they're doing is they inject a special dye that shows up on an X-ray, and it allows them to visualize the fallopian tubes and the uterus.
Oh, so it's like giving the doctors a roadmap so they can see what's going on in those areas.
Exactly. They can see if the fallopian tubes are open. The medical term for that is patent, and they can check for any blockages, scar tissue, any abnormalities in those areas.
Makes sense. Again, it seems like no matter what the issue is, those fallopian tubes always play a pretty central role.
It's the crucial meeting place, right? So if that pathway is compromised in any way, it can really throw a wrench in the whole system.
Right. So this hysterosalpingography, it's all about those fallopian tubes. But it sounds like the diagnostic process overall, it's much more than that, right? It's about getting a full picture of what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about looking at hormone levels, ovarian function, potential genetic factors. It's really trying to get as complete a picture as possible.
So you've got this whole team of people, in a sense, working together to try to figure out what's going on.
Right. And I think it's important to remember that this whole phase of testing, it can be incredibly stressful for couples. I mean, you're waiting for appointments, you're waiting for results, you've got the financial burden that often comes with these tests.
Right. So it's a lot to handle. It's easy to focus on the medical side of it, but the emotional and the mental toll, those are real factors too.
Yeah, for sure.
And once you have been through all that testing, you've got a clearer picture of what's going on, then you're faced with, okay, what are our treatment options? And I'm imagining that probably brings its own set of emotional challenges.
It does, because now you're talking about decisions that could really impact your life, big decisions.
So where do you even begin? When it comes to treatment, the source does talk a lot about lifestyle changes. Is that typically the first line of defense?
It often is. Before jumping into medication or assisted reproductive technology or anything like that, usually the first step is to look at those modifiable risk factors that we talked about earlier.
Right.
So, if someone's a smoker, quitting smoking, that's going to benefit their overall health, but it also could potentially increase their chances of conceiving.
Right. It's empowering, too, in a way, to feel like there are things you can actively do to try to improve the situation.
Exactly. And that's part of what the source emphasizes. But it also acknowledges that, not all infertility stems from lifestyle choices.
Right.
Sometimes there are other factors at play, and that's where those other interventions come in.
Like the medication that the source mentions, Clomid. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So Clomid, it's a medication that's often prescribed to women who are having trouble ovulating.
Okay.
And it basically stimulates the ovaries to release an egg, and that can increase the chances of conception.
So it's kind of like giving ovulation a little bit of a nudge.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. And this is important, the source makes this very clear, Clomid can increase the risk of multiple births.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because it's stimulating ovulation, there's a higher chance that more than one egg will be released, and if that happens, you could end up with twins or triplets or more.
Wow, so that's a whole other set of things to consider when you're weighing those options.
It is. And Clomid is just one example. I mean, there are lots of different medications that are used in fertility treatments.
Okay.
And beyond medication, you've got surgical interventions. And then there are assisted reproductive technologies, which is often shortened to RT.
So things like IVF.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So surgery might be recommended to correct a structural issue, like maybe there are fibroids that need to be removed, or maybe there are, blockages in the fallopian tubes that need to be repaired. And then RT, that encompasses a whole range of procedures.
Mm-hmm.
You've got in vitro fertilization. That's where the fertilization actually happens outside of the body.
Mm-hmm. And then you've got egg donation, surrogacy, a whole range of options there.
It's really incredible when you think about all the science and technology that's involved now and helping people achieve this dream of having a child.
It really is remarkable. And the source that we've been discussing, it does a great job of outlining the medical side of all of this. But even still, we've just scratched the surface. I mean, this is a huge, complex landscape.
It is. We've talked about the science, the technology, but we've also talked about the emotional weight of this journey, the social pressures that so many couples face.
Yeah, it's so much bigger than just the medical definitions and the procedures.
Right.
It's about real people, real couples, going through something that is incredibly personal and often very challenging.
So for our listener, if you're on this journey, if you're dealing with these challenges, just know that you're not alone. There are resources available, there's support out there. And keep learning. Keep asking questions. The more you know, the more empowered you'll be to make the best decisions for you. Absolutely. And remember, even within this complex landscape, there's still hope.